We're going to read verse 27, verse 7 in the book of Proverbs. Oh, thank you.
Try pushing that there.
Oh.
Okay, might need a battery. It shows that it's on.
That's okay.
No, there we go. That's
Okay.
good. You're good.
We're good now. Okay. Proverbs, the 27th chapter, verse 7. Wise man said, "A satisfied soul loathes the honeycomb, but to a hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet." Now that has about 3 implications that I can think of. The first one is, don't ever go grocery shopping when you're hungry. Second implication is, I count on Nolan and Amelia leaving Eugene early in the morning so that they're really hungry by the time worship period is over and they go over to my house and I fix dinner. They like it. That's partly because they're really hungry. And then the last part of that kind of makes me think that when you're really hungry, you start paying attention to what you eat. You know who that is, right? That's Prince William and his adorable little daughter, Queen Charlotte. Now, one of these days, he's going to be the King of England. She won't, but he will be, one of these days, the King of England. And you know, there's something about, no matter how powerful a person you are, no matter how well educated you are, there is something that will strike fear into the heart of every man. Tell me if I'm right. It's when your daughter's getting ready to go to church on Sunday morning and your wife says, "Hon, can you fix her hair?" My daughters would tell you that I needed to learn a lot. I'm going to ask Kevin to come up here for just a minute, and he's going to show you a video, because when Prince William was asked how he learned to fix Charlotte's hair, he said, "I watched a lot of videos." YouTube videos, kind of like this one. Now, maybe this is the one he watched. I don't know. This is how you put a ponytail in your daughter's hair. Okay? You don't even need the sound. Use a vacuum cleaner, suck up all the hair, put the ponytail holder on. Maybe that's not the one he watched. But I can just imagine how important it is in that family in particular that your daughter's hair looks cute when she goes out and she's going to greet the public. So we're going to apply that to Proverbs, the 27th chapter, and verse 7. Something tells me that Prince William didn't spend all of his free time combing the internet looking for videos of how to fix your daughter's hair until he had a daughter. Once he was hungry, that video meant something. And we're going to talk a little bit about equipping the saints today. We've already read Ephesians, the 4th chapter, and we know how important the church is to God. And we've already seen, and Jack has discussed on a number of different occasions, how God did some things to make sure that the church would prosper. Ephesians, the 4th chapter. Remember? He gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. Doesn't say that apostles and prophets still exist. And we could talk about how the Bible talks about the limited nature of the responsibility that the apostles and prophets had. And we could talk about how that office in the church, or that gift to the church, doesn't exist anymore. We could talk about how the second level of gifts that God gave to the church, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, how those gifts still exist. And having been an evangelist, I spent 26 years preaching that's the way that I made my living. I don't do that anymore, but I did that for 26 years. I have been an evangelist. I've also been an elder. And so I understand a little bit about what this means. He said the purpose of those gifts was for something very specific, to equip the saints. We want to be equipped. We need to be equipped. And he goes on a little bit further in this passage, and he describes all of the different purposes for which saints were going to be equipped. God continues to gift his church today. He continues this office, these offices that we've talked about, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. He put them in the church for a very specific purpose, to equip the saints. There's a practical necessity that's laid upon us when we understand a providential approach to the church, and how God's providential approach, equipping the saints, means that we have a responsibility. We want to be successful as a congregation of God's people. And there are some challenges that we have to contend with. The first is what I call a revolving door syndrome. I didn't come up with that, somebody much smarter than I did. The revolving door syndrome is people that come to church here in South Salem for a little while, and then they move on to a different place, and they worship in a different place, and then they worship in a different place, and then they come back and they worship with us for a while, and then they go somewhere else and they worship somewhere else for a while. It's kind of a revolving door syndrome. Some churches grow and they become extremely large, mostly because the revolving door is pointed at them at that particular point in time. But the church is not really growing. The church is just swapping members. There's another challenge, and it's getting every member involved in the work of the church. Now, I went back to graduate school, and I became a psychologist. I am a behavioral psychologist. Not that I do work with individuals, but I spend a lot of time now looking at experimental designs to teach myself and others how we can get people involved in whatever organization they're a part of. Now, right now, I do that with higher education. Flavel Yeakley, in 2008, published a book. It was called Why Churches Grow. Now, let me just stop here for a minute and tell you a little bit about myself. I preached in Norwalk when I was much, much younger. In fact, 1978, I'd only been married for a couple of years. And Norwalk was a fascinating place. We went for 13 weeks and we baptized an average of one person a week for 13 weeks. The church was just prospering. It was growing. We were introducing people to God. People were excited about it. It was fantastic. It was so incredible that we were driving to church one Sunday morning, and Nolan's mom was sitting in the back seat of the car. She said, "Dad, who's going to get baptized today?" I've never been around a group of people that were like that. And I like to think it was because the preaching was great. Well, you'll see in just a minute, that probably wasn't it. If you've listened to me long enough to know that that probably wasn't the reason that the church was growing by leaps and bounds. I moved to another place up in Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, and the church just flourished. This time it wasn't that we were introducing people to an initial belief in God, but we were finding people, they were coming out of the woodwork. They had been Christians, they had been active parts of the church, but something happened, life kind of overtook them, and they wandered off. They just didn't stay. So we weren't keeping the people that we were converting to God. Now, if you're a preacher, that'll take you on the other end of that roller coaster. Hey, those folks are leaving because the preaching's bad. And maybe that was part of it. I don't know. I preached in Brookings, Oregon. We started with 12. And 2 years, we had 55 people worshiping with us. That was fantastic. And again, I started thinking, well, you know, it's probably the good preaching that brings them. You're going to find out that wasn't it. Because Yeakley talked about why churches grow. Now, Yeakley is from a Church of Christ background, loosely constructed. He was a professor at Freed-Hardeman College, and this was the result of about 3 years of intensive study. He sent questionnaires to 3,000-something congregations of God's people, and then he distilled what he found. Now, Yeakley, because he was teaching at Freed-Hardeman, spent a lot of time thinking about what happens to people when they go away to college. And we're not going to talk about that. He has been criticized in some circles because many of the conclusions that he reached were, to say the very least, dismaying. It was difficult to read that book because Yeakley made the point that if we don't turn something around, the Church of Christ is basically going to stop existing. We're just not finding people to introduce to God. And the people that we do introduce to God, we tend to be leaving behind somewhere. So Yeakley talked about group dynamics in terms of every single member of God's body being involved intimately in the work that we're trying to do. So I'm going to read a little bit about what Yeakley had to say about getting every member involved. On page 73, he says those two barriers that we talked about before, converting people, bringing people to come to a knowledge of Christ, and then keeping people, once they have a knowledge of Christ, from just letting go and giving up. He calls this breaking the 75 barrier. In other words, getting 75 people who are introduced to God. And we're not talking about kids. We're talking about adults, 75 adults introduced to God. The other barrier that he talked about was finding 200 people who were interested in God and getting to the point that we had 200 individuals who were introduced to God, who were worshiping and working in a particular place. He says that beating both of those barriers depends in large measure on getting people involved in the church. Now, some people aren't concerned about that. Some people just kind of are happy with the status quo. But I don't think that's the case here. I know that the elders want us to be involved. They want us to reach out to new people, to introduce them to God, and we've spent some time doing that. We had Bring a Friend Sunday. It was a wonderful opportunity for us to introduce people to Jesus and see if they were excited about learning about Him. And now we're going to begin thinking about how we can keep people involved and prevent this problem that exists with people who are involved with God just sort of giving up on God. So in his book, Yeakley says And this makes a lot of sense to me. Now, I showed you that video before because we're going to circle back to that. This is what Yeakley said. The more involved a person becomes in the work of the congregation, the more important the congregation becomes in his life. It logically follows, therefore, that a congregation which offers people many opportunities for involvement would be more successful in attracting and keeping people than would a congregation which offers few opportunities for involvement. That makes sense, right? Prince William didn't spend a lot of time browsing the internet looking for videos until he had a daughter. And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about God until we have a responsibility that we have to discharge. And when we have that responsibility, suddenly we get excited about it. You ever taught a class? And when you teach the class, you spend an awful lot more time preparing for that class than you would typically because you have a very specific responsibility. I didn't even clean my apartment this week because I had a responsibility that I had to discharge today. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about what I was going to say. That's just the way it is. It will always be that way. He went on. He said, evangelism includes more than just reaching the lost. It includes involving the members of the work in the local congregation. If a congregation does not use its members, it loses them. The congregations with the highest dropout rate were the congregations with the lowest involvement level. Doesn't have anything to do with how good the preacher is. Well, it has something to do with that, but doesn't have a lot to do with how good the preacher is. Now, if the congregation is growing, that's a little disappointing to preachers. If the congregation is declining, that's a relief. And I've been on both sides of that. If the congregation, he says, can maintain a high involvement level, its conversion rate will be higher, its dropout rate will be lower, and its net growth will be higher. Make sense? Now, what's the challenge? Involving people in the work of the local congregation. And there are two ways to think about active involvement of every member in the local congregation. In general, Yeakley observed, the larger the congregation, the lower the level. When the church grows really big, there are enough people to take care of all of the responsibilities, and so people don't get involved. When the church is really small, like we had 12, when the church is really small, everybody has to pull their part. He goes on. He says, why does the involvement level tend to decrease as size increases? The problem with the larger congregations is that they have not been able to increase the number of task assignments fast enough to keep pace with the expanding membership. There are a lot of jobs that need to be done. And when the church grows, we sometimes don't increase the jobs that need to be done. That is an actual problem. And when I was an elder, we pondered that constantly, knowing what the jobs were and how to match people up with the jobs that we had and how to make sure that the best people were doing the job to the best of their ability and how we could help to support them in the doing of their jobs. But then he goes on and he talks about not an actual problem, but he talks about a perception problem. He says, actually, the real problem was not always the actual roles to members ratio, but sometimes it was the perceived roles to member ratio. In other words, a larger congregation might actually have more than enough task assignments to go around, but the members might not be aware of the many ways in which they could get involved. So equipping the saints, giving the church, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, that all depends upon the church finding a way to communicate what the actual and the perceived roles that need to be filled are. If the congregation has a good actual roles to member ratio, but a low perceived roles to member ratio, the problem is one of communication. A congregation can have a high involvement level no matter how large. It becomes a question of communication. The congregation will do the necessary organizational work to have a high actual roles to member ratio, but the congregation's leaders need to struggle to make sure that that perception is also there. And I know that the elders here struggle with just exactly that. I know that Jack struggles with just exactly that. I know that all the teachers struggle with exactly that. Brad was teaching this morning. He said, you know how difficult it is to teach a class when everybody's sitting on their hands? It really is. It's not a very effective class when people aren't actively involved. If you're just sponging up what somebody is saying, then you're not actively involved. And if you are actively, one of the best problems that a teacher ever has is getting the class to shut up. I was a professor for a while, and I can tell you, you teach graduate students, those folks don't sit on their hands. They ask you all kinds of questions. Why is that? They're paying a lot of money to be there. That was when it occurred to me that actual involvement is what makes a difference. It's not how good the preacher is or how bad he is. It's not even the number of roles that we have. It depends largely on our attitude about the roles and the communication from those that are in charge to let us know that those roles are expected of us. Now we're gonna spend a little bit more time talking about this. We will talk about the diversity of the roles that are there for us, but we're going to stop now largely because I've just run out of time. We're going to stop now, and we'll take that up on Sunday night next week. So I'm going to ask Kevin, if he will, to come up and lead us in a song so that we can think about our relationship with the church.